Now that we've learned first species counterpoint, we can start to talk about second species counterpoint. This species of counterpoint is the first one to introduce dissonance on the offbeats. Now, while we typically will perform these exercises with whole notes for the cantus firmus and half notes for the counterpoint solution, you should know that you can really do them in any relationship of 2 to 1. You could even do these in a 6/8 time signature, a compound, or any simple time signature. So we try and reduce this to make it easier to understand the concepts at first, but once you really understand this, you can apply these concepts to really any composition where you need a 2 to 1 relationship. So here are some of your general second species rules. You can use 2 half notes to every whole note of the cantus firmus. So our cantus firmus we should be familiar with by now. It's the whole notes that we typically create our counterpoint solution on top of. So you're going to have 2 half notes instead of whole notes against whole notes now. The first half of the measure may use a rest, so you are now allowed to use a rest on that very first beat. But if you do that, the third beat, where your first note of the counterpoint solution comes in, still needs to fit the opening intervals that we've talked about. So that means if the counterpoint solution is above the cantus firmus, you have to have a unison, a fifth, or an octave. If it's below, it has to be either unison or an octave. You can now use passing tones and consonant neighbor tones. So notice that says consonant neighbor tones. You really shouldn't use any dissonant neighbor tones in second species if you're trying to create music that applies to or adheres to 16th century guidelines. So these tones can be used on the weak beat, never on the downbeat, so you can never have a dissonance on the downbeat, provided the embellishing tone begins and ends on a strong beat consonance. So what that means is if you have, let's say, a D in the bass, and you want to start with a fifth, you can come down to the fourth, which is a G. That's a dissonance, as long as it resolves to a consonant interval on the next beat. So as long as you do that, you're okay. Again, you can be given the rest. Unisons are allowed on the weak beats, and again on beginning and ending tones. If the counterpoint crosses above or below the cantus firmus, it must remain in that cross territory. So if you decide to go beneath the cantus firmus and you take an above solution to a below solution, then you have to stay there until the end. The other thing about the unisons, you can use them on weak beats, and there isn't really a rule on how you can use them, but just know that anytime you use a unison, it's going to sound a little bit weaker in the melody line, and it's going to sound like one of the voices did drop out. So it's always a good idea to try and avoid unisons anyway, but if you're stuck, they are an option now on those weak beats. You cannot have any repeated notes, so oblique motion does not occur in second species. So just keep that in mind. No repeated notes from the offbeat to the downbeat or from the downbeat to the offbeat. There's no place for repeated notes in second species. Your cadence patterns, and I'm going to show you this in more detail, but the final 2 or 3 notes above or below the cantus firmus may revert to first species whole notes. So what that means is if you want, you can use a first species ending. So in the third to last measure, you could use scale degree 1. Second to last measure would be scale, or we're really thinking in terms of modes, so the modal degree 7, and then you can come back to 1 in the final measure using whole notes. However, if you want to use a second species ending, if the cantus firmus is in the bass, you need a perfect fifth followed by a major 6. If the cantus firmus is in the soprano, so the cantus firmus is above, you can have a fifth followed by a minor third. And then these both, of course, will resolve to scale degree 1 in the final measure. So those 2 points right there, the cantus firmus and the bass, this refers to the second to last measure. Since it's half notes, you're going to have a fifth followed by a major 6, and then in the final measure you'll have that unison or octave. So hopefully that's clear. Consecutive skips or leaps that outline a seventh should not be used. For example, a perfect fourth followed by another perfect fourth emphasizes a dissonant seventh between the downbeats of each measure. So if I have a C, I go up a perfect fourth, and then I go up another perfect fourth, I'm really creating a dissonance. So we want to avoid these consecutive skips or leaps if they outline any seventh chords or anything like that. your dissonance in 16th century. So the downbeat must always be consonant in 16th century counterpoint. There are no exceptions to this. There will be a species where we allow dissonance on the downbeat, and we'll talk about that later. The upbeat may be dissonant, but only when moving by step. So the example here that I have, this is actually from the Fuchs textbook. I just put it into modern notation. We see an example of diminution. So here, this is a perfect second species example. This measure, we've got a C and a G, and then it just comes down to the E. Diminution occurs when the space in between the two notes is filled in by steps. So in measure 2, I just inserted an F. You still have that consonance, that dissonance that pushes it forward, and then that consonant resolution. So it still sounds okay to our ears. So this is something that you can actually do in second species counterpoint. If we look at measure 3, we've got C and E, and then we have a C and an A. So here, this is an example of how you might have diminution beneath it. We just fill in the space between the C and the A. So if you look at measure 4, it sounds okay because that resolution, the dissonance, has been resolved. In measure 5, we have another example. We have that octave, the F. So these are all ways that you can use diminution in second species to really create this idea of this ebb and flow between consonance and dissonance. It's this constant game of this consonant stable tone followed by stepwise dissonance, followed by a resolution of that dissonance, also by step. And notice that all of these are passing tones. There are no neighbor tones. We're always resolving that dissonance by step. So the dissonance needs to be approached by step and left by step, the definition of a passing tone. Okay, so the cadence. Here's an example of your cadence. If it's above the cantus firmus, we have a fifth, followed by a major 6, and then we have our octave. So it sounds something like this. Below the cantus firmus, same thing. You have a fifth, but then it becomes a minor third. And if you understand the difference, when you invert a major 6, it becomes a minor third. That's an important concept, but that's more of a theory issue. So if we look here, we've got the E in the soprano, and we have an A in the bass. It comes up to your minor third, and then it just comes down into that unison. So those are your cadences. That's how you want to write your cadences. Again, remember that in Phrygian, you do not want to have that leading tone. Alright, so what is wrong with measures 9 and 10 here? Go ahead and pause the video if you need to, and take a look at what's happening in measure 9 and 10. I'll give you 3 seconds and I'm going to give you the answer. Alright, so measure 9 and 10, they actually create parallel fifths. So we have an F and a C here, and then an E and a B. And what it ends up sounding like is something like this. Let's try that again. It sounds very archaic. So you want to avoid these downbeat to downbeat fifths. You also want to avoid downbeat to downbeat octaves. So we couldn't have an F here followed by an E. So if we look at measure 12, 13, and 14, here's a series of parallel octaves on the downbeats. You've got your C going to your D, your E going to your D, going to your C. And this is effectively what we're hearing on the downbeats, these octaves between the soprano and the bass. Since they're only separated by a third, they're even more noticeable. If they were separated by a fourth, you could actually get away with this, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. So here's an example of what's really happening when you have fifths. So here you have a G and a D, that's a perfect fifth. and then there's a third, and then here we have another perfect fifth on the downbeat. We really hear these perfect fifths when we write them like this. So here's measure 12. It really just emphasizes that sound of the octaves in parallel motion. So do it one more time. It just sounds a little bit clunky. In measure 18, we have a perfect fifth. So here, it sounds very archaic. You just hear those parallel fifths. You really want to avoid that. Part of the problem with fifths and two-part counterpoint is that there's no quality to the chords. It's ambiguous. The other issue is that those fifths, they really just stand out, and since they're such transparent intervals, the fifth and the octave both are transparent intervals, we tend to lose the independence of the lines. And with counterpoint, it's always about that independence of the lines. We really want independent lines. We want to be able to hear each individual line functioning as its own. So what happens if you have octaves interspersed by fourths? It's not so bad. If we hear the thirds again in comparison, oops, then we really hear those octaves. If you separate it by a fourth, it becomes less of an issue. So hear that perfect fourth? It's less problematic. According to Fuchs, the ear forgets. The same is going to be true if you leap down a fifth or a sixth. Anytime you have a really wide interval, it sort of invalidates the sound of those consecutive octaves or fifths. So typically you can't do this with a fifth, so the only option you're going to have available is the octaves interspersed by fourths. But if you really get stuck, this is one way to avoid the sound of those parallel octaves on the downbeats. So let's look at measures 3 to 4. Why is this 6 going into a fifth okay? It's still direct motion into a fifth on the downbeats, but it's not a fifth going to a fifth. So is this okay? And it's also separated by a fourth. Let's listen to that real quick. So measure 3, we start with an E in the bass, and then we have a C in the counterpoint solution. So here we go. And if we played that entire measure, it seems a little less offensive than if we were to move from a fifth into a fifth. So let's play this with a fifth. So I'll change measure 3 to a B. It really emphasizes the sound of that downbeat to downbeat fifth. So in measure 3 to 4, this perfect fourth allows the ear to forget. Don't forget the leap of a fifth or a sixth could also be used, although in this instance it wouldn't be possible, because if we had a leap of a fifth, it would be a leap into a dissonance. And remember, all of our dissonance have to be approach and left by step. Don't use a second. So you don't want to have a C going down to a B here and then resolving to an A. That will really emphasize the sound of the fifth. It really emphasizes that fifth, and we don't want that. In first species, remember we had to be careful about those ascending minor 6 leaps. You could only use them descending. You didn't want to use them ascending. In second species, it's allowed. if you need to get away from the canus firmus. So here, let's say I want to put some more space in between my canus firmus and my counterpoint solution, I can actually use a minor 6. And it sounds okay, so let's go ahead and play this. Sounds pretty good. So now the octave can also be used. So here we have a perfect 4th jump in the bass, which kind of necessitates a leap of an octave to get away from it. So both of those options are now okay. So when you complete your solutions, what you need to do is you use the basic premise of the starting and ending, the first and last pitch for first species. You still want to have that single high point, and you want to try and include as much dissonance on the offbeats as you can. And so I will actually post another lecture that explains and shows you actually step by step how to complete a second species counterpoint, but this is sort of your study guide for the main rules and exceptions that are allowed in second species.